There is a story most people believe about ancient humans, that they spent most of their lives on the edge of starvation. The idea goes like this. They killed a mammoth and gorged. Then they starved for weeks waiting for the next lucky hunt. This image is everywhere. It became the foundation of scientific theories about why modern humans struggle with obesity and diabetes. The logic was simple. Our bodies evolved to store fat because food was always scarce. Now food is everywhere, and the fat storage keeps going. There is just one problem with this story. When researchers actually tested it, the data said something completely different. Hunter-gatherers did not experience famine more often than other groups. If anything, they experienced it less than the farmers who came after them, less than the civilizations that replaced them, less than what most people assume. The starving caveman, it turns out, was never quite as hungry as we have always imagined. So what is the truth? How did ancient humans actually handle hunger when it came? The answer involves clever social engineering, dietary flexibility, and a body built for scarcity in ways most people never expect. Let us start by dismantling the myth properly, because understanding why it is wrong tells you almost everything. A major study analyzed a large database of documented hunter-gatherer societies specifically to test the starvation assumption. The researchers expected to find constant famine. What they found directly contradicted that assumption. Hunter-gatherer groups experienced lean periods, seasonal shortages, temporary dips in available food. Multi-year famines causing serious mortality were genuinely uncommon across the populations studied. Compare that to early farming communities. Crop failures could happen in any drought year without warning. Recurrent multi-year food crises became common wherever farming first intensified. The historical record backs this up. Frequent crop failures and famines appear constantly in the written history of farming societies. Large-scale famine records for hunter-gatherer populations remain comparatively rare across the same time period. The short version is almost the opposite of what most people assume. Hunter-gatherers had fewer and shorter famines than early farmers. So why does the starving caveman myth persist so stubbornly despite the evidence? Partly because farming looks like obvious progress. It seems counterintuitive that the lifestyle it replaced was more food secure. And partly because a popular scientific theory built on the starvation assumption became so influential, nobody questioned it for decades. We will come back to that theory. First, let us look at what ancient humans were actually doing to avoid hunger. The first and most important strategy was dietary breadth, eating from as many different sources as possible. Researchers call this broad-spectrum foraging, drawing from meat, fish, nuts, tubers, fruits, shellfish, and wild grains. Whatever the local environment offered, whatever was in season, whatever was available that day. This mattered enormously. A hunter-gatherer group's survival never depended on any single food source succeeding. If the big hunt failed for a week, there were still tubers to dig, nuts to gather, and shellfish to collect. Compare this to early farming societies, which increasingly concentrated their entire caloric intake around one or two staple crops: wheat, barley, rice, maize, depending on the region, all the eggs in one basket. That concentration created great efficiency when conditions were good, but enormous fragility when conditions turned bad. A single crop failure could wipe out the majority of a community's food supply in one disappointing season. Hunter-gatherers spread their dietary risk across dozens of different food sources at once. They had built in a natural insurance policy without ever consciously designing it that way. One source fails, the others cover it. Two sources fail, the others still cover it. This is the same principle behind a diversified investment portfolio. Do not put everything in one place. Ancient humans understood this not as an abstract principle, but as lived reality built into how they ate every day. The second major strategy was mobility, a freedom that farming communities gave up the moment they chose to settle. Because hunter-gatherers did not depend on land tied to one location, they could simply move when local conditions got worse, following resources as they shifted across the landscape, relocating away from drought or depletion. Hunter-gatherer groups typically needed access to anywhere from 7 to 500 square miles of territory. That sounds like a lot of land, until you realize that having it was precisely what let them avoid localized food crises. Farmers gave up this option the moment they invested in tilled fields and permanent buildings. When the soil failed or the rains did not come, a farmer could not simply pack up and walk somewhere better. A forager could, and frequently did, within days of conditions deteriorating. But perhaps the single most clever strategy had nothing to do with finding food at all. It was about sharing it. Researchers studying documented hunter-gatherer societies found something genuinely elegant in how food gets distributed. Successful hunters shared their kills widely across the broader group, not just with their own family. This created an interconnected web of obligation and reciprocity across the entire community. If you shared generously today, you could expect others to share with you during your own lean periods. A mathematical analysis found that the sharing structure minimizing starvation risk organizes around the most successful hunters. Food flows first to their immediate families, then outward in waves across the wider community. This meant no single family faced immediate crisis even when their own hunt failed repeatedly. As long as someone in the group succeeded on any given day, the food reached everyone. This is risk pooling, the same underlying principle behind modern insurance. Built into ancient social life, no contracts, no written rules, just deeply held cultural norms of reciprocity enforced by reputation. A hunter who hoarded food and refused to share built a reputation that meant nobody shared with him when his luck ran out. The system enforced itself. Generosity today was investment in your own future survival. 3 strategies so far: dietary breadth, mobility, food sharing networks, each covering for the weaknesses of the others. Now the strategy that researchers have only recently started to take seriously: scavenging. For decades, scavenging was treated dismissively, a primitive, embarrassing phase early humans supposedly outgrew. The evolutionary equivalent of eating cold leftovers before humanity figured out how to cook a proper meal. But more recent research overturned that assumption entirely. A study found that scavenging animal carcasses was not a desperate last resort. It was a smart, deliberate strategy. It required far less energy than actively hunting live, fleeing prey, while still providing calorie-rich, nutrient-dense food, bone marrow, fat, organ meat, all accessible from a carcass. During periods of real environmental scarcity, carrion may have been one of the most dependable food sources available. What made humans uniquely capable of eating scavenged food was a combination of biological advantages. Strong stomach acid. Early humans could digest meat that had already started to decompose. Most other animals cannot. Long-distance walking. Humans could cover enormous territory searching for carcasses that still had usable meat remaining. And fire. Cooking scavenged meat killed remaining bacteria and extracted fat and marrow in ways no other scavenger could match. Stone tools let humans access fat and marrow locked inside bones. Resources other scavengers could not reach at all. Scavenging worked alongside hunting and plant gathering as part of one flexible integrated food strategy. Not a backup plan, not an embarrassment. One more reliable card in a well-stocked deck. When a hunt failed or plant foods were scarce, scavenging was simply the next option. Calm, practical, effective. 4 strategies now: dietary breadth, mobility, food sharing, scavenging, all working at the same time, each one covering for the others, each one adding resilience the other 3 alone could not provide. But what happens when all 4 strategies still are not enough? When genuine food scarcity arrives anyway. This is where the story takes a genuinely fascinating biological turn. When food runs short, the human body does not simply weaken in a straightforward linear way. It moves through a structured multi-stage sequence of adaptations specifically built to extend survival. Stage 1, the first 24 to 48 hours without food, the body burns through readily available glycogen stores. Glycogen is stored glucose, held in the liver and muscles, available immediately, goes first. Simultaneously, the body ramps up gluconeogenesis, making new glucose from amino acids and glycerol to keep the brain running. Stage 2. After 48 hours, something more sophisticated kicks in: ketogenesis. The brain switches its primary fuel source from glucose to ketone bodies derived from stored body fat. This dramatically reduces the rate at which the body needs to break down muscle protein for fuel. The body is now running primarily on fat reserves, preserving muscle, preserving function, buying time. Overall metabolic rate also drops. The body burns less energy per hour, stretching reserves further. This is mediated partly through changes in thyroid hormone activity. The body actively adjusts its own engine speed. After 4 to 5 days, the body settles into a relatively stable fat-burning state, a state that can sustain a person for over a month in someone starting lean, potentially over a year in someone with substantial fat reserves. The human body is not helpless in the face of food scarcity. It is extraordinarily well equipped to handle it. This biological machinery is what originally inspired the thrifty gene hypothesis. First proposed in the 1960s, the idea that genes promoting efficient fat storage offered a survival advantage to ancient humans. If ancient humans faced regular famine, those who stored fat most efficiently during good times survived the bad times better. Those efficient fat storers passed those genes down. Eventually, most of the population carried them. Then the modern world arrived. Food became abundant, but the fat storage genes kept running at full speed. Hence obesity and diabetes, an ancient survival advantage that became a modern health problem. It is an elegant theory, clean, intuitive, and for decades it dominated mainstream thinking about modern metabolic disease. There is just one problem. The theory requires ancient humans to have experienced frequent severe famines, frequent enough to create strong selection pressure for fat-storing genes across the whole population. And as we covered at the start of this video, that assumption does not hold up when tested against real data. If hunter-gatherers did not experience frequent severe famine, the thrifty gene theory loses its foundation. Researchers have proposed alternative explanations. One of the most compelling involves predation pressure. For most of human prehistory, being too heavy meant being too slow. Too slow meant getting caught by predators. Predators actively removed the heaviest, slowest individuals from the population generation after generation. This kept body weight variation in a tight range for millions of years. Heavy individuals simply did not survive long enough to reproduce. Then roughly 2 million years ago, something changed. Fire arrived, weapons arrived, cooperative group defense arrived. Suddenly, predators were no longer effectively culling the heaviest individuals from the population. Without that pressure, genetic variation in body weight was simply free to drift in any direction. No famine required, just the removal of an older selection pressure that had previously kept body weight variation constrained. This is still an active scientific debate. Researchers genuinely disagree on which explanation is correct. But it illustrates something important. An entire field of obesity research was built on an assumption about ancient hunger that was never properly tested. When researchers finally did test it, the assumption turned out to be considerably weaker than anyone expected. This is how science works at its best. An assumption gets challenged, data gets gathered, the story gets more accurate. Now let us bring it all together. What was the actual experience of ancient humans dealing with food scarcity? Not constant white-knuckle survival on the edge of death. Not one bad hunt away from starvation. Something considerably more organized, more flexible, and more resilient than most people have ever imagined. Let us walk through what a period of real food scarcity actually looked like for an ancient hunter-gatherer group. The rains did not come when expected. The animal herds moved earlier than usual. The berry season was shorter. The group notices the change quickly. They have lived in this landscape their whole lives. They read it constantly. First response: broaden the diet immediately. Switch to foods that are still available even if less preferred. That require more digging. Seeds that require more processing. Smaller prey that requires less energy to catch. Second response: adjust the territory. Move toward areas that are still productive even if farther away. Follow the animals. Find the river that still has fish. Locate the valley where plants are still producing. Third response: tighten the sharing network. Reduce waste. Ensure every part of every caught animal is used. Bones cracked for marrow. Fat carefully rendered. Nothing discarded that could provide nutrition. Fourth response: increase scavenging activity. Cover more ground. Be alert to opportunities the usual strategy misses. Meanwhile, the body is already adapting. Metabolic rate dropping slightly, fat reserves beginning to be drawn on more heavily. The group is leaner, but not collapsing, not panicking, managing, adjusting, waiting for the season to turn. And lean periods in most environments were seasonal. They had an end. The rains would return. The herds would come back. The group knew this because they had seen it before. Every year. The lean season was not a disaster. It was part of the pattern. And when the productive season returned, the food sharing network meant the whole group recovered together. Not just the successful hunters. Not just the strongest individuals, everyone. Because that was how the system was built to work. This is the reality that the starving caveman myth misses completely. Ancient humans were not isolated individuals desperately competing for scarce resources. They were tightly organized social groups with sophisticated shared strategies for managing exactly this kind of challenge. The community was the survival tool. Without it, individual survival would have been genuinely much harder. Now let us talk about what changed when farming arrived. Because farming did not just change the food, it changed the risk. Hunter-gatherers spread risk across many food sources, large territories, and mobile communities. Early farmers concentrated risk: one crop, one location, one growing season per year. All or nothing. When it worked, farming produced more calories per acre than foraging ever could, which is why populations grew, which is why cities eventually became possible. Farming was genuinely more productive, but more productive in good years also meant more vulnerable in bad years. The trade-off was built into the system. A hunter-gatherer facing a bad season could draw on dozens of backup food sources and walk to better territory. A farmer facing a bad season had none of those options, just a failed crop and an empty storage room. The problem got worse. More people depending on the same narrow food base, more people with no alternative food sources, more people who could not simply walk away from a failed harvest. Social inequality in farming societies also concentrated food access in ways hunter-gatherer food sharing simply did not allow. In a hunter-gatherer band, hoarding food while others went hungry was socially unacceptable and practically impossible. In a large farming society, with granaries and markets and rulers, food inequality became structurally possible and common. The historical record of famine in agricultural societies is long and grim. The historical record for hunter-gatherers is comparatively short. This is not an argument that farming was a mistake. It made everything that came afterward possible. It is simply an accurate accounting of what was traded away to get there. Dietary flexibility for caloric productivity. mobility for permanent settlement, communal sharing for specialized production. The people who made those trade-offs were not irrational. They were responding to real pressures and real incentives. But the cost in food security was real, and it fell hardest on the most vulnerable members of early agricultural societies, the ones least able to draw on the social networks that had protected hunter-gatherer groups for hundreds of thousands of years. So what does all of this actually tell us? The first lesson. Resilience comes from diversity and flexibility, not from efficiency alone. Hunter-gatherer food systems were resilient precisely because they never concentrated everything in one place. The most efficient system is rarely the most resilient one. Ancient humans understood this through experience. The second lesson, community is a survival technology, not a luxury, not a nicety, a survival tool. The food-sharing networks of ancient hunter-gatherer groups were mathematically sophisticated risk-pooling systems, built not from written rules but from cultural norms enforced by reputation over generations. The third lesson, our bodies are more capable than we give them credit for. The multi-stage metabolic response to food scarcity is a remarkable piece of biological engineering, not a sign of vulnerability, a sign of millions of years of refinement for exactly this challenge. The fourth lesson, the assumptions underlying scientific theories deserve testing, even popular ones, even decades-old ones. The thrifty gene hypothesis was influential and intuitive, and it was built on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. Testing that assumption did not destroy the theory entirely, but it made the picture considerably more complicated and accurate. More complicated and accurate is always better than simple and wrong, even when simple and wrong is more satisfying. The fifth lesson. The starving caveman was never quite as hungry as we assumed, which means the people who came before us were more capable, more organized, and more sophisticated than popular imagination allows. Not lucky survivors of constant desperate hunger, skilled managers of a complex and resilient food system, a system built over hundreds of thousands of years of refinement. Not designed in any single moment, evolved continuously, and a system that, in important measurable ways, outperformed what came after it in terms of food security and resilience. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The people we imagine as primitive may have been more food secure than many who came after them. Here is what all of this actually means. The next time you feel hungry between meals, consider what that feeling is actually doing. It is not an emergency. It is not your body failing. It is a system that was built for scarcity performing exactly as designed. Your ancestors felt that same signal and responded to it with dietary flexibility, mobility, sharing, and adaptation, not with panic, with a system they had built and refined and lived inside for hundreds of thousands of years. And when the strategies were not enough, their bodies handled the rest, through the same elegant multi-stage response your body has right now. The starving caveman is a myth. The real story is considerably more interesting. Ancient humans handled hunger through remarkable dietary flexibility. No single food source could bring them down. Through mobility, simply walking away from scarcity rather than being forced to endure it. Through food-sharing networks that pooled risk across the entire community before anyone invented the word insurance. Through scavenging, a smart, deliberate strategy that researchers spent decades dismissing before finally giving it the credit it deserved. And when genuine scarcity arrived anyway, through a body that responded with structured, elegant biological precision. Burning fat, preserving muscle, reducing metabolic rate, stretching survival further than any simple calculation would predict. Your ancestors were not desperate, gaunt figures waiting to either gorge or starve. They were organized, flexible, and resilient. They built food systems that outperformed early civilization in food security, and they maintained them for most of human history. The tools were simpler, the knowledge was deep, the results spoke for themselves, and the body they passed down to you still carries every one of those ancient adaptations. Ready, waiting. Built for exactly this. The starving caveman never existed. What existed was something considerably more impressive. A species that figured out how to manage hunger before it invented writing, before it built cities, before it developed any of the structures we call civilization. Subscribe to Ancivex, a new ancient history video every 2 days.